The Sony A1 is Sony's flagship full-frame mirrorless camera representing the best photo and video technology that Sony has to offer. After many dives with the camera, we think this device is a unique technological masterpiece for underwater photo and video creatives, and here's why. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. I'm Nirupam with the Underwater Photography Guide and Bluewater Photo, and I am here today with the Sony A1. This is Sony's flagship mirrorless camera. It's one of the most exciting cameras this year. It is a full-frame mirrorless camera with a 50 megapixel stacked CMOS sensor. It can take 8K video up to 30 frames per second, 4K video up to 120 frames per second, and it can take burst photos up to 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter. The shutter in this camera has been updated massively compared to other cameras on the market. Sony has really introduced new technology into this camera, specifically when it comes to the electronic shutter. So rolling shutter has been greatly reduced for both photo and video. You can also now sync strobes, external flashes with the electronic shutter in a few situations. It's not perfect yet, but what that means is you can shoot 30 frames per second with strobes, underwater, with the electronic shutter, without the mechanical shutter, and that's just a new technology that we haven't had yet. The A1 can also shoot with sync speeds up to 1/400th of a second, which is about a stop more than most full-frame cameras on the market. But before I get into the full review, I want to talk a little bit about who this camera is meant for, specifically when compared to the Canon EOS R5, which is really the only other equitable camera to the A1 at this point. So first off, if you're a Sony shooter, the A1 is the best camera that you can buy. There's no arguing that fact. I think the sensor's been greatly improved from the A7R IV, and they've reduced the resolution, but you have a cleaner image, there's less noise, there's less problems with motion blur because of the small pixels. So I think 50 megapixels is perfect for a full frame high resolution sensor. It's not quite as good as the A7S III when it comes to video options, but it's an amazing video camera when you compare it to the A7R IV or the A7R III, particularly with the fact that this is the first Sony camera that can shoot 8K video. So if you're a Sony shooter, you can't get better than the A1. And what's most exciting for me is that all of the housings out currently have compatibility with both the Sony A1 and the Sony A7S III. It's very rare that two completely different cameras have compatibility with the same housing, and what that means is you can shoot with one housing and have two different bodies without needing to buy a whole nother housing, and you'll have Sony's best video camera, the Sony A7S III, and the best photo camera from Sony, the Sony A1, all in one system. So ultimately, I think this is the ultimate best Sony system for a Sony shooter. But when we compare this camera to other cameras on the market, and currently there's only one that's comparable, the R5 from Canon, I would say that the A1 is a little bit overpriced. And this is after I've dived with this camera for a week. I do think that if you're just a normal photo video shooter, even if you're a professional, it's worth saving the extra $2,800 and going for the Canon R5. Now there's a few reasons I say that. The R5 and the A1 are very similar when it comes to their specifications and also their functionality. But I also think the Canon R5 has a better selection of lenses. So the R5 and the A1 can both shoot 8K video, they can both shoot 4K video up to 120 frames a second, and they both take high resolution photos, 45 megapixels on the R5, 50 megapixels on the A1. Now, when you look at the burst shooting speeds, it is faster on the A1 with the electronic shutter. But to use the electronic shutter on the A1, you do need to have a TTL converter that works. And we're still working on a full list of compatible TTL converters that will trick your Sony camera into thinking that it has a Sony flash. If you use a normal strobe with the electronic shutter, it does not work if you don't have a TTL converter. So that's important to keep in mind. So I would say overall, the burst rates are actually pretty similar between both of the cameras. Now, rolling shutter is improved, but in most underwater situations, you want to be as still as possible, and hopefully rolling shutter isn't a factor in your video when you're taking video. Overall, I think the autofocus systems on the R5 and the A1 are very similar. I think the autofocus system is actually slightly better on the R5, especially for underwater shooters, because the animal eye autofocus tracking only works on the R5. It doesn't work on the A1. So overall, I think if you're a Sony shooter, get the A1 with the housings, and then you can also shoot the A7S III, and you'll have the ultimate Sony system. But if you're starting from scratch, I would seriously consider the R5. Even the files, when I look in Lightroom, I think the files are very similar when it comes to editing, but I slightly prefer the Canon R5 files. Both cameras produce amazing quality images, amazing video, but I personally think the R5 is the better deal. But I should mention that overall, the Sony A1 is better than the R5 when it comes to video options. Now that's particularly in reference to codecs, bit rates, picture profile options. There's a lot more in the A1 than there is in the R5, but the A1 does only shoot raw video externally into a recorder. So there's some trade-offs for both cameras. Now, if you disagree with me and you think the A1 is better than the R5 for underwater photo and video, please speak up, drop it in the comments below, we'll respond. I'm curious to hear what you guys have to say about that. But these are just my opinions. I think with either camera, you're gonna have really some of the best results that you can get with any system. The R5 and the A1 are definitely the top systems right now this year. So without further ado, I am going to show you my massive underwater system that I have designed and artisanally created to show you guys how I shoot underwater. This is going to be the system that I use going forward, not just with the A1, but the A1 is kind of our test case, so we hope you enjoy some of the video that we capture. Now, this is the Sony A1 housing from Ikelite. It also fits the A7S III, as I mentioned, and I have attached to it an Atomos Ninja 5 with a Ninja 5 that's been donated to this review from Atomos, so thanks Atomos for that. We sell it at Bluewater Photo, and it's very useful. I'll drop a link below so you can see why monitors are great for underwater video especially. And I have in a, let's see if I can get it out. So I've got an Angelbird Atom X SSD, which is really the only SSD that works for the system. We also sell that at Bluewater, and thanks Angelbird for lending that for our review. I have it hooked up so you can watch the photos and videos that I take while I'm shooting underwater. So this is the system. I just thought it was really great. Final note is that Ultralight has this long clamp, which they also sent for this review, and I just think it's the perfect clamp for using with a monitor. It really sets up the monitor nicely underwater. It looks big and heavy right now, but underwater the monitor actually floats up a little bit because of all the airspace. And yeah, this is the clamp, so it mounts really nicely, keeps the center of gravity right over the camera, and it makes it easy for trim. So wanted to show you guys that system. Let's get on to the full review and you can see exactly how this camera does. Now, let's start with a quick discussion on the build and ergonomics of the A1. Overall, I think one of the most compelling reasons for a Sony shooter to get the A1 is that this is by far the best Sony camera when it comes to workflow, ergonomics, button options, and layout. I just really think Sony's taken all of the complaints that it's heard over the years, and there have been a lot, and really put the answers to those complaints in their engineering. The first thing that's really apparent is the menu layout has definitely changed. It's now a vertical menu. It's got more of an RGB kind of rainbow layout, which makes things very easy to look at. And the descriptions for each setting are just a little bit better than they used to be. But overall, it's not the deep, annoying Sony menus that you're used to. The menu is really, really intuitive, and I've been really happy when I shoot it underwater. As you can see in some of our sample underwater videos and our settings article, which I'm also going to drop below, it'll go through the full menu and exactly what you need for underwater photo and video. Now, the button layout is pretty much the same as the A7S III, but you have this new dial here on the left side of the camera. I actually don't really like this drive dial and autofocus mode dial. For one, it's not compatible with every housing out for the camera, particularly when it comes to autofocus mode. But also, you can't adjust the drive or the autofocus mode in camera. You have to use the dial, which to me underwater is a little bit annoying. So I actually tend to set everything above water and just not deal with it for the rest of the dive. Not so much the drive dial, but more the autofocus mode dial. But overall, the back layout is really nice. The FN menu is probably the most important menu for this camera. I put all of my settings and I customize it so that I hit one button, the FN button, and then all the settings that I would normally use quickly underwater, I can change to that. So the FN button is something I really rely on. The nice thing about Sony in particular is they have 4 customizable buttons, C1 through C4, and you can customize a lot of the other buttons as well. So that allows you to really quickly go through and hit different settings that you want, really customize your workflow on this camera. I put a viewfinder switch, a live view display, so I could shoot with or without strobes and have that affect my settings or not, so I can see underwater. I put an APS-C crop mode, so you can get a little bit more reach when you're taking some wide angle photos where the subjects aren't getting close, or macro. There's a lot you can do, and I go over all that in the settings article again. Now, when it comes to the triangle of exposure, there are 3 dials on this camera. There's a back dial here, and then a front dial. So this back D-pad also doubles as a D-pad, which makes it really nice and easy when you're flipping through your settings. There's a joystick for your autofocus control, so some housings have compatibility with it, some don't. And again, reach out to us at Bluewater Photo if you're curious about what controls are compatible and what aren't on different housings. The mode dial, I've been really enjoying using this mode dial in particular. It has the video mode and the manual mode right next to each other. So all you have to do is quickly switch between the two when you're underwater. And that's a nice thing to see in this camera. So now I'm gonna jump into a quick discussion on the image quality from the Sony A1. It is a full frame, high resolution camera. So the A1, as you know, can shoot 50 megapixel photos, and when you have 50 megapixels on a full frame sensor, each pixel is going to be slightly smaller than you would on a normal camera that would be more like 20 to 30 megapixels. So what that means for you as a photographer is that in low light situations, the sensor is going to be a little bit noisier. So you can't move your ISO as high as you would on a lower resolution sensor, like even the A7S III. One of the reasons that it's such a good low light camera is that it's 12 megapixels. But you do get the resolution. So when you are cropping your photos, you can make much higher quality prints from crops, and you can really crop down and not lose much detail, especially in your macro photos, but also for wide angle situations as well. If you guys remember when the Sony A7R IV came out, that was a 61 megapixel camera, and it still remains the highest resolution camera on the market with a full frame sensor. So the A7R IV did have some issues with noise and motion blur because you had so many small pixels crammed into one area. I really think that Sony has greatly improved the sensor when it comes to that noise issue when you have a high resolution sensor like that. I think that the images are a lot cleaner with the Sony A1. There's a lot less noise and it does a lot better in low light. So I had no problem moving my ISO, all the way up to 800, 1200, and I still got really nice clean shots. The dynamic range and the image quality overall is excellent. I do think it's probably my favorite Sony camera. I think that the color rendering on the files is really nice, and on top of that, the dynamic range performance is just really good. I took a few photos with sunburst shots, and you can see that the detail from the highlights to the shadows has a really nice transition of color, a really nice transition of detail, and I was able to pull out a lot of detail from the highlights and a lot from the shadows as well. So the image quality is really as good as you would expect from Sony's flagship camera. It is my favorite camera when it comes to image quality, when it comes to the files, working with images. It's just been really a pleasure to do that. Would I say the image quality is as good as the Canon R5? I think it's probably about the same. I think working with the files in Lightroom, I enjoyed working with the Canon files a little bit better, but overall the Sony files are very malleable. Their color accuracy is a lot better than it used to be with Sony cameras, and I've been really happy with it. So before I go into the rest of the review, I do want to talk about the most exciting features on the Sony A1, which is the updated shutter and sensor technology that Sony's introduced with this camera. It goes way beyond what other mirrorless cameras can do, and it really is an exciting aspect for underwater photographers in particular. Now, what Sony has done is they've created a stacked CMOS sensor, 50 megapixels as I mentioned, that has a very quick sensor readout. So all the data that's being collected from the sensor, it's basically going down a line and collecting all that data. It's way faster than other cameras have been able to do in the past. Now what that allows the camera to do is it allows it to take photos without a mechanical shutter, with the electronic shutter, as you can in mirrorless cameras, but allows it to do it much quicker than other cameras. So this fixes a few things. The first thing it does is it fixes rolling shutter. Now, rolling shutter is an issue particularly with video, where the sensor readout is causing the image to look kind of jello-y if your camera is moving around or a subject is moving around very quickly. Now, it does the same thing with photography as well. Rolling shutter can cause distortion in your electronic shutter images, but that's been basically fixed with the Sony A1. So now when you pan really quickly with video, you don't get that jello-y rolling shutter look. And when you're taking photos of quick subjects, you don't get so much distortion. Now that's exciting just in general, but what's even more exciting is that the quick sensor readout has allowed underwater photographers to use the electronic shutter with external flashes like strobes. It doesn't work in every situation. I should mention that you need a TTL converter that tells the A1 that your external strobe is actually a Sony flash, because it only currently works with Sony flashes. Now, if you do have that capability, then you can shoot 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter, which is the fastest burst rate on this camera, and insanely fast with your strobes. Now, your strobes may or may not be able to keep up, so I do recommend using very high power high-speed strobes like the CNC YSD3 or the Ikelite DS161s that can keep up with shutters or with burst speeds like that. Now, in a lot of situations, you'll have to shoot at a lower power for the strobes to actually keep up. But some of these strobes can shoot without any recycle time below half or a quarter power. Now we're going to have to come out with a list of compatibility when it comes to what strobes and TTL converters actually work with the A1. So in the meantime, reach out to us at sales@bluewaterphotostore.com or drop us a question below and we'll give you that information. I know currently that I use the electronic shutter with the Ikelite DS161s and the Ikelite TTL converters and the Sony A1, and it worked great. In fact, it's insanely fast. I couldn't believe how quickly I was shooting. I was super happy with the results that I got with this camera. I think that if you're a photographer who's in very quick situations with quick animals and you're not shooting into the sun all the time, this combination of strobe, TTL converter, and camera with the electronic shutter is perfect, and currently there's nothing else on the market that can beat that. But going beyond that, the fast processing power of the A1 allows us to also have a sync speed with the mechanical shutter of 1/400th of a second. Now that's about almost a full stop down from what normal full frame cameras can do, especially full frame mirrorless cameras, where most of the time sync speeds are usually at 1/200th, maybe 1/250th of a second. So 1/400th of a second is very exciting for anybody who's shooting sunburst shots. Or shots with situations with very high dynamic range. I was able to shoot directly in the sun 1/400th of a second and get really nice details coming from my sunballs in shallow water. But on top of that, if you're shooting really fast subjects and you really need to freeze the frame, 1/400th of a second is going to do it. All right, so let's move on to what everybody really wants to know about, which is autofocus. But don't just take my opinions from me. I've decided that, I don't like giving these subjective opinions about autofocus. I really want some objective information for you guys. So check out these clips that I took with the Sony A1 where you can really see the autofocus at work. Now, as you probably know, Sony is really well known for their autofocus technology. It's always been at the forefront of autofocus technology for any camera manufacturer, and with the Sony A1 they're really showing off the best of what they can do. I think the autofocus system on the A1 is absolutely phenomenal. I think it's the same system that's probably on the A7S III. I noticed that system was phenomenal as well. It is a small upgrade from the A7R4. It's very hard to notice if you're not a professional. You're gonna see very fast autofocus systems in both cameras, but overall I was pretty struck with how tight and sticky the autofocus tracking is underwater. In these clips that you're seeing, I was not using a focus light. So this is the camera in very low light and very dark conditions with 10 feet of visibility using the autofocus, and I was using the autofocus tracking and it was hitting every time. I really didn't have a problem getting the autofocus right. In my photos, I could focus on composition, and that's what I'm always looking for in a camera. Now, if I want to compare it to the Canon R5, it's hard to say. They're both very similar when it comes to their autofocus capability. But when it comes to the animal eye autofocus tracking, I have to say that in the Sony A1, it's not quite there yet. So Canon really wowed us as underwater photographers when it came to the animal eye autofocus tracking. They were able to produce a camera in the R5 that really kept up with fish eyes and was able to pull those out in difficult situations underwater. Now, the A1, I was not able to ever get the animal eye autofocus to acquire on any fish eyes. I tried it in bird mode. I tried it with just normal animals, which would be for dogs and cats, and it never really hit anything. I didn't see the focus box come up for the eyes. So that was a disappointment for me, but it really doesn't matter, because if you have autofocus tracking as good as you do on the Sony A1, that autofocus point is going to stick to whatever you tell it to stick to, and it's going to stay there. So I was very happy with it. I really don't care that, the autofocus tracking for eyes is not quite there for fish yet. I'm sure it will be with the next round of flagship camera. Finally, I do want to mention that if you use the Metabones adapter to adapt Canon lenses, the autofocus speed does slow down quite a bit, to a point where I found it to be very annoying. So I was using the Canon 8 to 15mm fisheye, which is my favorite fisheye lens for Sony cameras, and the the speed of the autofocus is just not quite there. Is it any worse than doing the same thing with the Sony A7R IV or the Sony A7S III? No. I'd say that the autofocus system with the Metabones adapter is about the same for every Sony camera. It's a little bit slower when you compare it on A6000 series cameras, but on the Sony A1, it's slow, but it works. So what I decided to do was use a single autofocus point mode and lock onto my my focus point and then pan the camera to get the right composition. Now, I should remind you guys, if you do have a housing that doesn't have compatibility with the autofocus mode switching dial, that you will need to do that before you actually get in the water with the camera. So that can be, you know, a little bit frustrating at times. You just want to make sure you have the right lens on, and then you'll have to decide, do you want to shoot autofocus continuous or autofocus single? I think if you have a Sony lens, keep it on continuous. You don't really need to be in any other mode. The autofocus is so good that you don't need to be in autofocus single. Let's talk video. Basically, from what I see with the Sony A1 is that it's just a Sony A7S III that's been upgraded with a larger sensor, and all the same great video features that you see on the A7S III are packed right into this camera. You've got the same picture profiles with different log picture profiles. HLG shooting, Cinetone has been added to both cameras, which was previously only available in our cinema cameras from Sony. So we've been able to really play around with different picture profiles, and I really enjoyed post-processing all the video clips, as you saw in the video at the beginning of this video. Going beyond that, the A1 has a lot of different options for codecs, bit rates, color sampling. Generally, if you are going to be doing a lot of post-processing with different picture profiles, I would recommend shooting at 422 10-bit, which you can do internally. The camera will also export 16-bit RAW like the A7S III on an external monitor. I recommend the Atomos Ninja 5, which we do sell at Bluewater. If you are going to connect an external monitor to the A1, you will be able to shoot 16-bit RAW, and it's going to be a huge benefit to anybody who's really into color correction, grading, getting the most detail out of your camera in the most dynamic range possible. One of the exciting things about the Sony A1 housings are that you can use an external monitor on both the Ikelite housing and the Nauticam housing. If you do get a Ninja 5 or an external monitor, I highly recommend the Angelbird Atom X SSD drive. It has insanely fast read and write speeds and just really works well underwater. So that's the drive we used. Again, we sell this at Bluewater Photo, so reach out to us, we'll get one for you. Overall, when it comes to low light capability with video, I found that I was able to push the ISO up to 12,000. I didn't really want to push it up farther than that, and I still got really nice and clean video. I don't think it's obviously as good as the A7S III for low light video. The A7S III is equipped with a 12 megapixel sensor, which just makes every pixel larger and better at handling low light. But that being said, the A1 does surprisingly well for a 50 megapixel sensor when you compare it to the video footage on the A7S III. There is some degradation, but it's not as much as I would have expected. Now, what that 50 megapixel sensor really does is it allows the A1 to take 8K video. So 8K video is not for everybody. For many people, it is just a spec. It's not really something that people often use. However, it's very good for macro video and sometimes wide angle video, where you can really crop down on your subjects from 8K down to 4K. So if you're going to be producing a 4K video, having 8K video gives you more reach than your macro lens would have just by itself. And I found that to be very useful when shooting video underwater. Now, I should warn you that data rates are huge with 8K video. So I've noticed that about 20 minutes of 8K video is roughly 300 gigabytes, and that's a lot of data. So you'll want a really large SSD drive like the Atom X. You'll want an external monitor if you're going to shoot 8K video. Otherwise, you're going to start filling up your cards pretty quickly. And I should mention that when you are filming 8K, you know, there's some misinformation out there that the Sony A1 won't overheat. It does overheat, and it will overheat after about half an hour, about the same as the R5. Now, if you look at the Canon R5, there's a time limit on when the video will just clip and stop taking so the camera can cool down. There's no time limit on the A1, but it will stop at a certain point. Now, we haven't done a full overheating test yet, but I have noticed that the temperature warning did come up after about 20 minutes of shooting 8K, 4K at 120 frames a second video, kind of a mix of both those during the dive. So I did get a temperature warning. It is something that you'll have to think about, but that, again, that's a lot of data going through the camera. And if you're really taking that much 8K video, you might want to consider the kind of project that you're working on. Overall, I would say you're probably not going to run into those temperature warnings on a dive with either camera, so I wouldn't worry about it all that much. Now, the final thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to video with the A1 is the stabilization system. It has the same active steady shot stabilization, which I believe corrects about 5 to 5.5 stops in the Sony camera, and changes if you have a stabilized lens as well. I found that it was great for hand-holding video, but it was not nearly as nice as the A7S III. One of the things that's missing on the A1 is the active steady shot stabilization mode, and I do think that's because at 8K you're using the full sensor, so they didn't offer it there, but it would have been nice to see at 4K. Active steady shot just goes one step above the stabilization that's built into the camera. It uses a little bit of electronic stabilization mixed with the mechanical, and I just found it to be excellent on the A7S III, and it's something that I wish I saw on the A1. Overall, I'm happy with the stabilization on the A1, but it's not nearly as nice as the in-body image stabilization on the R5. So if you need really stable video, you're in a lot of handheld situations, the A1 might not be the camera for you. I would probably suggest the A7S III or the Canon R5. Moving on, let's talk about some underwater housing and lens options for the Sony A1. I got lucky today. The UPS guy knocked on my door, and now I have both housings for the A1 that are currently available. On my right, I have an anodized aluminum housing from Nauticam, and on my left, I have a polycarbonate housing from Ikelite. Now, there's a reason that these two housings are so special, and there's a reason why I consider them to be the best Sony systems on the market. Both housings are compatible with both the Sony A1, which is Sony's best photo camera, and the Sony A7S III, which is Sony's best video camera. That means you have two bodies that can fit in one housing, and it's really your most economical option to take advantage of Sony's best features for both photo and video. So if you want the ultimate system, this is it. And ironically, even though you're getting a flagship camera, it is the best value for money for an underwater system. So the reason the A7S III is a little bit better than the A1 for video is mostly because of the low resolution sensor. That's the main reason that I would also additionally add an A7S III when you're shooting an A1 in these housings. On top of that, the A7S III does have better stabilization, like I mentioned. So I'm going to do a full overview of each housing for the A1 and individually, and I'm going to drop that in the description below. But until then, let me talk a little bit about a rough overview of why I like both of these housings. On my left, you can see I have the Ikelite A1 housing, and I've been shooting this for the last week during my review. This is a pretty cool feature, but for the first time ever, I have a Ninja 5 from Atomos attached to my A1, and I can do that because Bluewater is currently working with Ikelite on getting an M24 bulkhead attached on any of their newer full frame housings. So if you're interested in getting an external monitor for your housing, reach out to us at sales@bluewaterphotostore.com. We'll get that set up for you. We can get you an M24 bulkhead, and you can get set up with your Ikelite housing in that way. Now, the Nauticam housing also has an M24 bulkhead. So currently with both systems, you can shoot 16-bit raw video externally to your Ninja 5, which we also sell at Bluewater, and you'll be quite a happy camper if you're into video. Now, if you're not into video, that's totally fine. Both of these housings have full control over the A1. I should mention that there are few control differences. So the Nauticam housing does have a focus drive and a joystick control. And then the Ikelite housing is compatible with Ikelite TTL. There's a wide range of port options. Both of these housings can fit most Sony lenses. So if you have any lens questions, ask us and we'll let you know what ports and systems you need for that. The Ikelite housing does have a clear back, so you can see if there's any issues inside of the housing when it comes to leaks. And it also has a vacuum system that's built in. You just need to buy the pump separately. Now, when it comes to the Nauticam housing, you can get a vacuum system from Nauticam. You can put it into the M14 bulkhead right here, and it works quite well. It also has a moisture alarm system built inside, so if anything goes wrong in the housing, it'll give you a nice alarm on the back, and it'll be an audible alarm, so you'll be able to hear it. So the real difference is with Ikelite, you're going to be seeing it. With Nauticam, you're going to be hearing it. Again, I'll do a more detailed review of both of these housings, so feel free to watch that in the link that I put in the description. So that's about it, guys. That really covers most of the main features that I wanted to talk about on the Sony A1. As I mentioned, I'm really happy shooting this camera. I do think it's the best Sony camera on the market currently. I do think that if you're looking for an excellent full-frame camera, the A1 is a little bit overpriced. But if you want the best of the best and you have some money to spend, really the A1 is the best of the best. It does have just a little bit more video features than the Canon R5 does, that really put it over the top when it comes to one of, the best cameras for underwater photo and video hybrid in the full frame market. But overall, I think the photos and videos from the A1 really speak to themselves. I'm happy that I was able to use the Ninja 5 to really show you guys what's going on in this camera underwater, and going forward I'm going to be doing the same thing with our future reviews. If you guys have any questions about the A1, make sure you drop them in the comments below. Send us a message at sales@bluewaterphotostore.com. Reach out to me. I'd be happy to answer any questions. If you like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, like us on Facebook, Instagram. You'll see lots more content from the A1 there. We're putting out a full written review about the A1, so I'm going to drop that in the description, as well as our settings article and a review video about the settings as well, where I go through all of the settings using the Ninja 5 and how I would set it up for underwater photography and video. So with that, I'm going to leave it at that, and I hope you guys have some great dives with the A1. I'm really excited to see some of the content that comes out from this, especially when it comes to some of the sunbursts shot at 1/400th of a second. I think that's pretty cool. Let me know if you guys use the electronic shutter and how you like those blazing fast speeds, because I certainly did, and I'm really looking forward to seeing some of the action shots that people get with this camera. Anyway, have a great day. Have some awesome dives out there. I know things are starting to open back up, and I'm looking forward to coming back to you guys with some more content.